The note had been folded twice, then folded again, as though the hand that wrote it did not trust paper to hold a secret. Cecily Vane had carried it inside her left glove since Thursday morning, and it was now Saturday afternoon, and the crease at its center had softened from the warmth of her palm into something almost like old cloth. She had read it so many times that she no longer needed to unfold it. She could feel the words through the kid leather. "Your husband lives. Come quickly." There was no signature. There was no seal she recognized, though there was an impression left in the fold as though a thumb ring had pressed there in haste. The paper was good quality, but dirty at its edges, as though it had traveled some distance before it arrived in the hands of the beggar boy who had pressed it against the iron gate of the Aldrich house without a word, and then vanished entirely into the gray of a November morning. Mr. Birch sat across from her in the blue drawing room with his hands folded over his leather case in the manner of a man who had seen much grief and learned to observe it from a careful distance. He was the solicitor for the Vane estate, now acting in the interest of Mr. Reginald Aldridge, who had inherited the earldom of Ashvale 7 months ago when the courts, having waited the proper season and more, had rendered its official conclusion. Edmund Vane, 6th Earl of Ashvale, had perished at the crossing of the River Douro in June of 1813, and his title and entailed properties passed to his nearest male cousin. Cecily had been present at that proceeding. She had sat in a room full of men whose careful sympathy had the texture of finality, and she had listened to the date inscribed onto the record with the same particular attention she now gave to everything, which was to say, the attention of a woman who had learned to receive bad news without making it more difficult for the men who delivered it. She had not wept. She had not wept in the drawing-room either. She did not weep easily, a fact Edmund had once told her he found both admirable and slightly unnerving. That was before the peninsula. That was before a great many things. "My dear Lady Ashvale," Mr. Birch said, and the title landed with a quality of discomfort that told her clearly he was no longer certain it applied. "I understand that receiving such a note must be deeply distressing." "It is not distressing," Cecily said. "It is a statement of fact, or it is a lie. One of those is distressing. The other is not." Mr. Birch shifted in his chair. Lady Aldridge, who had been seated at the window with the posture of a woman who owned the room entirely, drew in a small breath through her nose. "The widow," she said to her husband, who stood near the fireplace with the expression of a man wishing he were somewhere else entirely, "will simply have to accept that these things happen. People with malicious intentions do not require much to construct a cruelty. A piece of paper. A beggar boy who cannot be found again. It is a very old and very unkind trick." Cecily did not look at Lady Aldrich. She looked at Mr. Birch. "Is there any record," she said, "of a body? Of Edmund specifically? A name on any regimental list?" Mr. Birch hesitated for precisely the length of time that told her the answer was no. She thought that was not nothing. She thought, a man reported lost in a river crossing is not the same as a man reported buried. She had thought this before, in the early months, and she had been told, gently and firmly, by men who spoke the language of comfort very fluently, that hope was its own kind of affliction. She had eventually let them convince her because she had not had the resources, financial or otherwise, to keep arguing with the machinery of official conclusion. She had never been entirely certain. She pressed her left hand against the outside of her right glove and felt the folded paper inside it. "Come quickly," it had said, as though time mattered, as though wherever he was, whoever he was, he knew that the world had already finished the paperwork on Edmund Vane and was moving forward without him. The drawing room was warm and full of other people's furniture. The Aldridges had moved their own pieces in and shifted the Vane family portraits to the gallery. There was a large ormolu clock on the mantelpiece that had not been there when Cecily had last felt at ease in this room. It ticked with a particular insistence, as though marking something. Cecily stood, smoothed her lavender skirts, and thanked Mr. Birch for his time. She had decided, though she had told no one yet, what she was going to do. If you find yourself moved by the question of what she found, you might stay a little longer. Some answers are worth waiting for. Edmund Vane had proposed to her in the spring of 1810 in the garden of her father's house in Wiltshire, during the sort of quiet afternoon that only becomes significant in retrospect. She had been 20, he had been 28, and he had been direct in the manner of a man who had thought about the matter carefully and arrived at a conclusion he trusted. She had accepted with equal directness, which had surprised him, and they had stood for a moment in the garden, looking at one another as though taking the measure of what they had just undertaken. She had liked him. It was not a small thing. He was steady and precise, and had the quality, rare in men of his rank, of listening to what a woman said rather than waiting for her to stop. He had a dry sense of the absurd that emerged in unexpected moments and vanished before anyone else in the room had caught it. Their marriage had been 2 years of careful mutual discovery, interrupted always by the knowledge that he would eventually return to Spain, where he had served in the campaign since 1809. The interruption had come in February of 1813. He had his commission, his orders, and a particular expression she had come to recognize, which was the expression of a man who knew that duty and preference were not the same thing, and had made peace with that. She had stood at the door and watched his carriage until she could not see it any more. She had not gone inside immediately. She had stood there in the cold, with the quality of stillness that was not acceptance, but its imitation. The letter had come in October of that year. It had come from his commanding officer, and it had used language that was formal and sorrowful, and careful in the way of official language, which is to say, it had said everything except that anyone had seen him die. She had read it 3 times that first evening, and then she had put it in the fire, which she did not tell anyone. The courts had taken their time. There were procedures. She had endured them. When the title passed to Reginald Aldridge and his wife descended on the London house with their own clock and their own particular arrangement of furniture and their particular brand of management, Cecily had remained because there was nowhere else immediately to go, and because the house still contained Edmund's library and his father's portrait and a piano that had been his mother's and that no one in the Aldridge household played. She had been managing the transition, which was to say she had been smoothing the domestic frictions that arose between a new household and an old staff, when the note arrived. She had not slept well since Thursday. She had lain on her back in the room that had been hers and Edmund's, which Lady Aldridge had tactfully suggested might be more comfortable for Cecily, given the guest suite's superior light, though what the suggestion had meant was that Lady Aldridge wished to install her sister in the larger room, and Cecily had moved her things with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had long ago learned to calculate which fights were worth the expenditure of self. The ceiling of the smaller room was unfamiliar. The sounds of the house settling were familiar. She had lain on her back and held the note above her face in the dark, and read it with the small light of the candle she kept burning on the nightstand, as though reading it enough times might produce new information. It never produced new information. It only produced the same 6 words with the same accumulating weight. "Your husband lives. Come quickly." She had thought, on Thursday evening, that the note might be Lady Aldridge's doing. It had the structure of a cruelty designed to produce humiliation, give a widow hope, let her act on it, correct her publicly, establish her as unbalanced. It was the kind of thing a person organized around the protection of their position might arrange. She had tested this theory from every angle and found it possible. She had also thought on Friday morning that the paper was too good for a manufactured cruelty. A person arranging a performance of grief would not have used such paper. They would have used something unremarkable, anonymous. This paper had the quality of something retrieved, pressed into the nearest available hand, sent in the manner of a message that needed to leave quickly and could not wait for better materials. She had thought about this and looked at the thumb impression in the fold. And she had decided. The coaching inn at Richmond was called the Ashvale Arms, which was either a coincidence or a very precise instruction, and Cecily arrived there on Saturday evening, having told Lady Aldridge she was visiting a friend in Kensington, and having told no one else anything at all. She had taken a hackney carriage alone, a transgression of propriety she registered without concern, and arrived at the inn in the early dark of November, with the note still in her glove, and a steadiness in her hands she was somewhat proud of. The street outside was loud with carriage traffic, and the smell of coal fires and roasting meat from the inn's kitchen, and she stood for a moment in the cold and looked at the painted sign above the door, and knew. Someone who understood exactly what this name would mean to her chose this place deliberately. That was not nothing either. The innkeeper was a broad man with a careful face who looked at her for a moment too long when she gave her name. Not the look of a man who recognized a title. The look of a man who had been told to watch for someone and was confirming that the correct someone had arrived. He went behind the counter without a word and produced a small parcel wrapped in brown paper, sealed with a simple wax press that had no crest. He said, "There is a private parlor on the right, my lady, if you should prefer." She took the parlor. Inside the parcel was Edmund's signet ring. She had known it was his before she fully unwrapped it. She had known by the weight of the parcel in her hands, and by the quality of the stillness that had settled over her when she held it. The ring was gold, cast with the Vane family arms, worn at the shank in the particular way of a ring worn for years on a large hand. Edmund had worn it on his right hand, and the inside was inscribed in letters too small to read without bringing it close. 4 abbreviated words she did not need to read to know. E.V. to C.H., 1810. He had had it made for their wedding. He had pressed it into her hand on the morning of the ceremony as a kind of supplementary promise, and then put it on in the evening when she gave it back. He had been wearing it when he left for Spain. She sat with it in her palm for a long time. The fire in the private parlor was warm, and the noise of the inn's common room was muffled through the door, and she was alone in a way that was different from the aloneness of the Aldrich house, which was the aloneness of being surrounded by people who had already decided what her situation was. This aloneness was clean. She was alone with something that had no explanation, yet except the true one. She had been told to prepare for the possibility that Edmund was dead. She had prepared. She had done what was required of her. She had managed and endured, and declined to weep in drawing rooms, and answered official correspondence with measured language, and arranged herself into the shape of a woman who had processed her grief and was moving forward sensibly. She had done all of this because she had been told it was necessary, and because she did not have the resources, in any sense, to do otherwise. She had never sent his ring to be melted. She had asked the courts what had become of it, and they had told her it had not been found on any body, and she had taken that information home and put it somewhere private, and had not visited it when she did not need to. She held the ring in her palm and closed her fingers over it, and thought about the shape of a hand large enough to wear it, and the warmth it would have held from that hand, and the war and the river, and the months between then and now. He was alive. He was afraid of something. Whatever it was, they could address it. She opened her fingers and looked at the ring again, and then she turned it to read the inscription once more in the firelight, and then she put it on her own finger, where it was far too large. And she sat with it there until the fire had burned down enough that she needed to ring for the boy to build it up again. She sat with the ring in her gloved palm for a long time in the private parlor of the Ashvale Arms, and did not permit herself to draw any conclusions that could not be tested. Then she unfolded the second note, which had been tucked beneath the ring in the parcel. It read, in the same uneven hand, Haverford House, Berkshire. Come Tuesday. She came Tuesday. The road from London to Berkshire in November had the gray and damp quality of a road that is not sorry for its conditions and does not intend to apologize for them. The carriage Cecily had hired jolted over the last mile of it through a fine, persistent rain, and she arrived at Haverford House in the early afternoon with her traveling cloak thoroughly wet and the particular tiredness of a person who has not slept properly in 5 days. Haverford House was not large, but it was old, and it sat in a fold of the Berkshire Hills with the comfortable self-possession of a house that did not need to declare its consequence. It belonged to a Captain Marcus Haverford, who had served with Edmund in Spain and whom Cecily had met exactly once at a regimental dinner in 1812. She remembered him as a man of middle height, with a habit of standing very still in rooms and watching people. She had thought at the time that he and Edmund had the same quality of attention. She had thought, too, that a man who watched rooms the way Captain Haverford did was a man who had come to trust very few people, which was possibly why Edmund had trusted him. She arrived to find the door opened by a young groom named William, who was perhaps 14 and whose face, when she gave her name, passed through several emotions in rapid succession before settling on a kind of relief that seemed out of proportion to the occasion. He took her cloak and her traveling case with a care that was not the practiced care of trained household staff, but the more personal care of someone who has been told to be careful of something that matters. Captain Haverford was not present. He had been called to London suddenly on Monday, she was informed, but she was expected. There was a room prepared. There was a fire. She was shown the library. But before she reached it, she passed through the back corridor near the kitchen passage, and she heard the raised voice of the housekeeper, Mrs. Daines, dressing down a young footman over a broken piece of plate in the manner of a woman who had been given authority and was exercising it without pleasure. The footman was perhaps 17, and was standing with his back straight, and his face composed in the particular way of a young man who has decided he will not make this worse by showing how bad it is. Cecily stopped. She was not yet seen. She stood in the corridor and listened to the inventory of the offense, and when it reached the part where Mrs. Daines said that the captain's instructions were clear and damages would be taken from wages at the end of the month, Cecily stepped forward and said quietly that she would settle the matter and that the footman need not concern himself. Mrs. Daines looked at her. The footman looked at her. She gave the housekeeper the sum required from her own purse, which she could ill afford. And she told the footman that his wages were intact, and that she hoped the rest of the week went more smoothly. She did not wait to be thanked. She did not require being thanked. She turned and went toward the library because that was where she had been directed, and because she did not do things in order to be observed doing them. She was not aware that she had been observed. She was shown the library. The library had the quality of a room that had been used heavily and recently. 2 chairs pulled close to the fire. Books open on the table and on the side table and on the window seat. A blanket folded over the arm of one chair in the manner of a man who slept there more than he slept in his bedroom. The fire was fresh. The tea things were laid. Someone had been in this room that morning. She was setting down her traveling case when she heard from the corridor outside William's voice, low and urgent, and another voice beneath it, quieter and slower, the kind of voice that spoke each word as though it had been considered before release. She did not move. The young groom had returned to the kitchen after admitting her, and she had not understood until this moment that he had gone to tell someone she had arrived. She had not understood that she had been expected not only in the general sense, but in the specific and immediate sense, which was to say that whoever had sent the notes had been near enough to know the moment she came through the door. The library door opened. She had been in this room with its fire and its books and its smell of damp wool and wood smoke and something she could not name but recognized. And she had been steadying herself with the inventory of the room for 10 minutes, and none of it had prepared her for the moment the door opened and Edmund Vane came through it. He was thinner than she remembered. The war, and whatever had come after, had taken something from his face that had not yet come back, and the hair at his temples had gone gray in a way it had not been when she saw him last, and he walked with a slight hesitation on the left side that was new, and that he had clearly been working to conceal, and was now not bothering to conceal. He had dressed carefully, which told her the most. The dark coat was pressed. The cravat was neatly tied. He had dressed as though he was going somewhere that mattered. He stopped 2 paces inside the door. She did not speak. She could not yet. He said, "Cecily." It was the first time she had heard her own name in his voice in 2 years and 8 months. It landed in her chest with a physical precision that she did not attempt to moderate. "Sit down," he said then, quietly. And he was already turning toward the chairs near the fire, as though the practical matter of her having somewhere to sit was the most urgent thing in the room. "There is tea. You have been traveling, and it is cold." She sat, not because he had told her to, but because her legs had made the decision on her behalf. He sat across from her, not close, and looked at her in the manner of a man who had been thinking about this moment for a long time, and was now receiving information that did not entirely match what he had imagined. "You came?" he said. "You sent a note," she said. "I sent several." "You sent 2 notes and a ring. I should like to know," she said. And her voice was steadier than she expected. "Why you did not come yourself?" He was quiet for long enough that she heard the fire settle. "I did not know," he said at last, "what I would find. I did not know if the house was still yours. I did not know if you had." He stopped. He turned the cup in his hands. "I did not know," he said again, which was not quite an answer. And she understood from the way he said it that the rest of the sentence contained something he was not yet willing to name. He was afraid. She had not thought this about Edmund before, and it rearranged several things. The warmth of the room settled around them. Outside the windows, the November light was already going. She did not tell him. Not yet about the Aldridges or their clock or Lady Aldridge's particular brand of carefully managed certainty. There was time for that. There was, she was beginning to understand, more time than she had believed there was 4 days ago. He handed her a cup of tea, and his hand, doing so, came close to hers, without quite touching it. Her pulse registered the proximity before the rest of her did. He was real. He was sitting 3 feet from her, and he was real. She wrapped her hands around the cup and looked at the fire. After a moment, he said, "I saw you in the back corridor, with Mrs. Daines and the footman." She had not known he was there. She did not let that show in her face, but she was aware of having been caught at something that was not wrong, but that was private in the way things done without an audience are private. He had not broken anything, she said. He was there, and the plate broke. But it was not his doing. I could see it from the way he stood. Edmund said nothing. He looked at her with the expression of a man receiving information he has already suspected and is now confirming. I should have sent word sooner, he said. I am sorry for the months you have spent in that house. It was not the apology she had expected, which had been something more along the lines of explaining the delay or accounting for the practical obstacles. This was different. This was the apology of a man who understood what the specific quality of that difficulty had been. She looked at the fire and did not say anything for a moment. You could not have known, she said. No, he said, but I am sorry for it. Lady Aldridge had not been idle. Cecily had returned to London on Wednesday morning and found the house in a state of tense and careful activity. There had been a note from Mr. Birch, forwarded to the morning room. There had been a call from Harriet Blaine, Mr. Aldridge's young cousin, who had sat in the drawing room for 20 minutes in a pale yellow walking dress, and spoken at some length about the difficulty of accepting complicated emotions, particularly for women of a certain disposition. The widow, Miss Blaine had said to the footman on her way out, at a volume she may or may not have calibrated for the staircase, was always rather anxious. It is no wonder this sort of thing has found her. Cecily had been standing on the landing. She had not gone down. She had stood on the landing with her hand on the newel post, and her face composed, and she had let Miss Blaine leave without acknowledging it. Because the alternative was to descend and say something she could not unsay. She had gone back to the library and sat at Edmund's desk, which was still his desk regardless of what the courts had decided. And she had thought about the 2 days she had spent at Haverford House. She had thought about Edmund in the library that evening, and the next morning, and the long walk they had taken in the cold of the Berkshire hills, with a proper distance between them as the propriety of their situation now required, because they had been apart long enough to have become, in the legal estimation of the world, strangers. She had thought about the moment he had produced from his breast pocket a folded letter, stained by water and age at its edges, and had held it for a long moment before placing it on the table between them, without a word. She had not read it then. She had not touched it. He had put it back in his pocket. She had seen his hand shake slightly as he folded it away, and she had understood that whatever the letter contained had been carried longer and further, and with more weight than the months of his absence accounted for. She had come back to London because he was not yet ready to come back to London. He needed another week, he had said. He needed to make certain of several things. He needed to send word to a person whose name he would not yet give her. She had respected this because she understood, having spent 21 months learning the art of managing what could not yet be resolved, that some necessities cannot be hurried. She was therefore in the London house when Lady Aldridge invited Lord Maberley to dinner. The invitation had gone out on Thursday. 30 covers. The senior peer of the county, who was also the Lord Lieutenant, and therefore a man of some procedural authority regarding the county's properties, had accepted. The dinner was to be held on Friday evening. Cecily was not invited. She understood what this meant. She sent a letter to Haverford. She did not wait for a reply. The evening of the dinner, she put on her best gray silk, the one she had made before Edmund left for Spain, and which still fit, and she went downstairs at 7:30 to present herself at the drawing-room and discover what she had come downstairs to discover. The drawing-room was full. She counted 9 familiar faces before Lady Aldridge appeared at her elbow, with the expression of a woman who has arranged things as she wishes them and is pleasantly surprised to find the arrangement unthreatened. "I am afraid this is a private dinner," Lady Aldridge said, in the pleasant tone of a woman who had never in her life needed to raise her voice to wound. "But you are welcome to wait in the morning room. I am sure we shall be finished by 10. Cecily said, "I shall wait here, if it is the same to you." It was not the same to Lady Aldrich. Harriet Blaine was across the room speaking to Mr. Aldrich's solicitor, and she had turned, and the look on her face carried all the confidence of a young woman who has been told her version of events is the correct one. "Lord Maberly," she said at a pitch to be heard, "I understand the widow has been behaving rather strangely these past weeks. It is very difficult, naturally, when grief takes a particular form." Lord Maberly said nothing. He was a large, quiet man of 60, who had the expression of someone listening to far more than was being said. Cecily was standing near the door to the hall when the door to the hall opened. The room did not understand what it was looking at immediately. It understood first that a man had entered, and that the man was tall, and had the quality of stillness that Edmund had, and that the man's face was Edmund's face, thinner and slightly unfamiliar, and unmistakably itself. Then the room understood all at once, and in the particular fashion of rooms that have been carrying a secret without knowing it, which is to say, it became very quiet. Edmund looked at the room for a moment. He did not look at Cecily yet. Captain Haverford had come in behind him, and behind Captain Haverford a man she did not recognize, who carried a leather case with the purposeful air of a solicitor's clerk. Edmund removed his coat without haste, and gave it to the footman, and then he turned to Lord Maberly with the direct regard of a man who had long ago stopped being uncertain about where he was in a room. "My lord," he said, "my name is Edmund Vane. I believe you served with my father on the county bench. I apologize for the lateness of the hour. I was delayed on the road." He produced a packet of papers from his inner coat pocket. "Captain Haverford has been good enough to accompany me as witness to my service and my recovery. I have here my discharge papers, a letter from my commanding officer signed in October of this year, confirming my survival and my identity, and a deposition from the regimental surgeon who attended me at Lisbon." Lady Aldrich said, "This is very irregular. One must be careful in such circumstances, my lord, as the estate." "The estate," Lord Maberly said, "will require some immediate and correct attention." Edmund then crossed the room. He crossed it at the pace of a man who had decided on a single destination and was not considering the geography between here and there. The room watched him cross it. Mr. Aldrich watched. Harriet Blaine watched. Lord Maberly watched. Lady Aldrich's fan stopped moving. Cecily was standing at the edge of the group near the hall door, and she had been standing very still, and watching him come and working not to let her hands show what they were feeling. And when he reached her, he stopped, and he looked at her, and his face in this moment was the face she had been looking for in the gray February of 1813, and in every gray morning since. "She is my wife," he said to the room. "I am alive." 6 words. He said them quietly. He did not look away from her face. Lord Maberly said, in the dry tone of a man who has heard enough, "The title of Earl of Ashvale passes immediately by right of survival to the living heir. The transfer to Mr. Reginald Aldrich is hereby void. The lady is the Countess of Ashvale." Lady Aldrich said something. Cecily did not hear it. She was looking at Edmund. He was looking at her. His hand had come up, and his fingers had found the back of her left hand, and the touch was light and careful, and everything she had learned to stop expecting. 6 words. There were people who spoke entire chapters and said nothing as true as that. A fortnight after the dinner, Ashvale House in the country was opened again. It had been closed for 2 winters, and the smell of it when the shutters came down was cold air and old wood, and that particular quality of a house that has been waiting. The staff returned in 1s and 2s from the places they had scattered to. William, the young groom from Haverford, came with them, having apparently decided that where Edmund went, he would also go, a decision Edmund had accommodated without comment, but with the faint expression of a man who found it quietly sustaining. Cecily was in the front morning room on a Thursday afternoon in December, with a fire and a small pile of correspondence and the gray winter light coming through the tall windows, when she found the letter. She had not gone looking for it. She had been mending the collar of Edmund's dark coat, which had come to her with a loose button and a frayed edge that the servants either had not noticed or had not thought it their place to address. It was the coat he had worn to the Aldridge dinner. She had been working at the collar when her needle caught on something in the inner breast pocket, and she had reached in to free it and found the paper there, folded and worn and stained along its center crease, with what had been water and was now old salt. She held it for a moment. He had told her, at Haverford, that there was a letter. He had shown it to her without letting her read it, and she had understood then that it was not something he had been ready to offer her. She had respected that because she respected him, and because she had also learned, in 21 months of learning things she had not anticipated having to learn, that some things must be given rather than taken. She read it now. It was dated February the 4th, 1813, 1 week before he had left for Spain. His handwriting was steady throughout, the handwriting of a man who had composed his thoughts before setting pen to paper, except in the final paragraph, where the letters tightened slightly, the way writing does when the hand knows it is approaching the thing it has been moving toward. She read the final paragraph twice. He had written, "I leave tomorrow, and I'm not afraid to go. I have examined that carefully, and I am not. What I find I am afraid of is this, that when I come back, you will tell me honestly, as you tell me most things honestly, that you have been content in this marriage, that you respect me and wish me well, and that what has been between us these 2 years has been good and sufficient, and no more than that. I do not know how to say to your face that I want more than good and sufficient, and so I am saying it here, to a letter you will never read, which is perhaps what all letters are anyway. I want to come home to something that cannot be managed away. I want you to want that too. I have no right to expect it. But I thought you should know." He had not sent it. He had carried it. She sat with the letter in her lap for a long time. The fire settled. Outside the window, the first snow of December was beginning, the soft, particular kind that did not hurry. Somewhere upstairs she could hear Edmund's steps, the slight hesitation on the left side that was already growing more even week by week, moving through the room above her in the recognizable pattern of a man who was learning again where things were in his own house. She folded the letter once, along its original crease. She tucked it back into the breast pocket of the coat. When he came downstairs and appeared in the doorway, she was still in the chair by the fire, the coat folded across her lap, her hand still. He looked at her, and she looked at him. She said, "You should have sent it." He was quiet. He came into the room slowly and sat down in the chair across from her, the same distance as the chairs at Haverford, and the fire between them threw the same warm light. "I know," he said. "It would have helped," she said, "considerably." He said, "I was not brave enough yet." She thought about the peninsula and the river crossing, and the months in Lisbon, and the 2 years it had taken to come back to England, and the 6 words in front of 30 witnesses at a dinner table. She thought about the varying shapes that bravery took depending on the terrain. "You seem to have found it eventually," she said. There was something at the corner of his mouth that was almost amusement, and had not been there, as far as she could tell, at Haverford. That was coming back. She reached across the small distance between the chairs and took his hand and held it in both of hers. He let her. His hand was warm, and his fingers, after a moment, turned to hold hers in return. On the mantelpiece above the fire, pressed beneath the base of the small candlestick she had moved there last Tuesday, was a piece of paper folded twice, and then folded again. Its edges were worn soft, and its center crease had the quality of old cloth from the warmth of a woman's palm. She had not thrown it away. She had not framed it. She had set it where she could see it from the chair and know it for what it was, which was the first true thing that had happened to her in 2 years and 8 months. It sat there quietly, asking nothing, requiring nothing, having already done its work. The snow fell past the window. The candle on the mantelpiece burned low. Neither of them spoke for a very long time, and neither of them needed to. If you have stayed until now, I am grateful for your company. Leave a word in the comments if Cecily's journey has settled somewhere in you. There is more where this came from. He had carried the letter for 3 years, across a war and a river, and a long recovery in a foreign country, and 2 years of believing she might not want what he wanted. She had carried a note in her glove for 5 days, across a drawing room full of other people's furniture, and a solicitor's polite disbelief, and a coaching inn at dusk, and a house in Berkshire in the cold. They had both arrived. That, in the end, was sufficient.